What's up, everybody? Rob here. So this is part 0 of a planned multiple-part series about the 30 Years' War. It is by far the largest project I've ever even attempted. I have no idea how long it's going to take. I have no idea how many parts it's going to be. But, hey, it seemed like a fun idea at the time, so why not? So the problem with the 30 Years' War is that it is an absolutely massive subject to talk about. It is the most devastating war in Germany's history if you go by percentage of the population. It is a conflict that involved every major European power except for Russia. They were involved at least in some way, even if it was just sending money to one side or another. And it actually paved the way for the idea of the modern nation state as we know it. So this is a huge topic, and I'm going to be going into more depth than I have in previous videos, but there's no possible way I can cover everything. People have made entire academic careers out of that. But I'm just going to, be breaking it down into digestible chunks, and I'm going to be going in multiple different directions. I'm going to be, in the next video, it's going to be more narrative, how the war started, and the defenestration of Prague, and the circumstances surrounding that. But I figured to start with, the biggest problem with history is where to begin. And to understand a topic, you have to, understand what happened before that, and then to understand that topic, you have to understand what happened before that, because these created the conditions which led to the event you're trying to study. Next thing you know, we're in, Mesopotamia dealing with the Assyrians, and, the Assyrians came later, but, whatever. You know what I'm trying to say. The point is, where do I even begin with this? I could just say, okay, May 23rd, 1618, 3 men were chucked out of a window in Prague. The second or third time this happened, the event was known as the defenestration of Prague. For some reason, there's this thing in Prague about throwing people out of windows. If you're in Prague, I don't know what you guys are doing over there, but, hey, whatever. But that doesn't really provide enough context. So rather than when to start, I figured a good place to go with the beginning would be a where. Specifically, the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the Holy Roman Empire at the turn of the 17th century, it's a complex subject. The Holy Roman Empire is a massively complex subject that people have made entire academic careers out of, and that is way, way beyond what I'm going to be doing here. It is complex, contradictory, very vague in some areas, and it's just confusing as you could possibly imagine. And to paraphrase one historian, you're just going to have to get used to some degree of ambiguity. So, when I'm going to be describing how the government works, and you're going to say, wait, that's very unclear and very vague, and I don't get how that works. It's exactly. So let's go into some geography and demographics before we go into the really complicated stuff. So the Holy Roman Empire is located in Central Europe, with the main population being ethnically and linguistically German. So basically, the main portion of it is in what is now modern-day Germany and Austria. However, you were to take Germany and Austria and then expand the borders outwards a bit from there, and that's more or less the Holy Roman Empire at this point in history. And there were 14 languages that were spoken within the Holy Roman Empire, including German, obviously, as the vast majority of the population spoke. However, they also spoke Wendish, which was a Slavic language north near the Balkans, as well as Czech, Polish, Italian, French, and many others. Now, most of the population lived in smaller towns and villages of populations less than 4,000 in total, sometimes as few as a few hundred. However, there were other cities as well that could have populations in the tens of thousands. Now, these settlements were almost always fortified to some degree. Now, the very small ones and the relatively impoverished ones would sometimes have little more than a wooden palisade for defense, something to just keep the cows from wandering around at night. Or maybe there's an occasional, bandit group in the area. You keep them away from the civilized portions of society, but not really much more than that. The larger towns and cities oftentimes had stone walls. They could afford to do so. However, oftentimes these were the relatively tall and relatively thin medieval-style walls, which were becoming increasingly vulnerable to the advent of gunpowder weapons. So as cannons became more effective, tall, thin stone walls of the medieval style were easily just blasted apart by these cannons. So the richer towns and cities started investing in the more modern Tres Italian style walls, which are low, thick, heavy walls with sloped surfaces to help deflect artillery shots, and because of their low center of gravity, they were very difficult to knock over. These, of course, were very expensive, and so only the richest towns could afford to do so. And oftentimes, the earlier medieval walls would be incorporated into the new bastion fort designs, getting some sort of a hybrid of the two. Okay, so the politics of the Holy Roman Empire was mind bogglingly complex. So, the best and most succinct way to describe the Holy Roman Empire is not a single nation, but rather a loose confederation of associated political entities led by a host of nobles of various titles, including, but in no way limited to, landed knights, landgraves, prince bishops, counts, dukes, and many others, all of which had various levels of importance and wealth, totaling 50 to 60,000 noble houses all in all of which were rivals with one another for influence and wealth, sometimes sparking into open fighting between them. So basically, the Holy Roman Empire was in a state of near constant civil war within itself. Now, hovering above this confusing morass of confusion and chaos was the Holy Roman Emperor, who was not a hereditary monarch. Instead, he was elected from the highest ranking of nobles, who chose amongst themselves who would rule the empire upon the death of the previous emperor. Now, they always chose a Habsburg, mostly out of fear, or at least they had been choosing a Habsburg for the past couple centuries, mostly out of fear, since the hereditary lands of the Habsburgs were some of the largest and wealthiest in Europe. Actually, about a century or so beforehand, the Habsburgs controlled both the Holy Roman Empire as well as Spain, which included the holdings in the New World, making Charles V the by far wealthiest and most powerful person in all of Europe. He would abdicate and the empire would split, the Habsburg holdings would split between the Spanish half and the Austrian half, but that's another story. So now, normally, feudalism is a rather decentralized system of government, but this is even more so because you have the decentralization of feudalism, combine that with the fact that these, look at this map here. This is actually a simplified map, and all those little varying color dots are technically somewhat independent nations who nominally owe their allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, whether they did or not, well, that depends on how strong the emperor was at the time and, how much could he exert his authority. But it's not, say, like England or France where, power comes directly from the king, so much as this is a separate entity and we're just agreeing to get along with each other with this Holy Roman Emperor as the head of this coalition. Think of it as a coalition rather than, a nation. Now, to make things even more confusing, the imperial constitution, which sets out the roles and duties of the government, the relationship between the varying degrees of nobles, the emperor, and the church, is incredibly long and mind-bendingly complex, yet at the same time is extremely vague. The actual exact limits of the emperor's power is undefined, mostly on purpose, so the emperor could actually exert his authority when he really didn't have any necessarily right to do so. For example, the emperor could just say, well, the imperial constitution doesn't say that I can't do this thing, whatever this thing is, and you're just going to kind of have to accept it. And then the nobles who were trying to undermine his power would say, yes, but it doesn't say that you can, though, and the two would oftentimes be at loggerheads with one another. Now, one thing that was clearly defined was that the emperor could call what's known as a Reichstag, or a parliament, which was required to pass universal empire-wide taxes or general laws affecting the entirety of the empire. Now, there were constant conflicts between the emperor and the nobles, with the emperor trying to exert his authority over his subjects, while the nobles doing pretty much everything in their power to limit the influence of the emperor and specifically the Habsburg family. Now, lesser nobles could and often did form confederations amongst themselves, so the Holy Roman Empire as a whole was a confederation of varying political entities, and then there would be confederations within these confederations, which further added to the confusion. And then on top of this, you have the normal political stuff that is commonplace in any sort of feudal or semi-feudal system, where you have nobles making alliances within each other. There's marriages and, other sorts of agreements like that. And just to sum this all up, in the words of historian C.V. Wedgwood, and this is kind of a long quote, so just kind of bear with me here, but it kind of sums this all up perfectly. I quote here, "These were only the more important members of this federation of individual governments, the free knights and counts who could declare themselves like Gotz von Berlichingen," and I apologize for mispronouncing that. 4 years of German in high school, that's the best you're going to get at me. In any case, depended only on God, the emperor, and himself. These were innumerable. There were perhaps 200 whose wealth and lands gave them such claim to consideration, and nearly 2,000 whose economic position was equivalent to that of an English country gentleman. Thus, a population of 21 millions depended for its government on more than 2,000 separate authorities. The lesser nobility, the knights and free tenants of the emperor, formed confederations amongst themselves where they were thickest on the ground, or came to an understanding with the chief administrator of the surrounding province where they were few. Yet, even making allowances for such arrangements, there were over 300 politically conflicting authorities in Germany. The mechanism of imperial government could not control the situation. Theoretically, the emperor could call a Reichstag, or diet, of all the independent rulers, lay his schemes before them, and seek their consent to make them law. No general laws or taxes were valid unless they had passed such a meeting. Unhappily, the Diet never met without fruitless wrangling over procedure and the right to vote. Among the various princes whom a single province had been divided, it was doubtful how many of them could vote in the Diet. The four divisions of Brunswick having dwindled to two, each prince exercised a double vote. But when Anhalt split into four, its representatives had to share one vote between them. Again, had there been some dispute over the division of land, the rivals would inevitably claim equal rights, causing ill feeling within the assembly and bloodshed outside of it. Now, in an attempt to streamline this incredibly confusing and chaotic mix was the idea known as the circle. The empire was divided into 10 circles, which each had their own parliaments, which were responsible for taxation and defense, and this included dealing with rebellions. Now, if attacked or if a rebellion were to break out in one of these circles, one circle could call upon up to two adjacent additional circles to help them out. Now, if this was not enough, these three circles could then call upon the help of two more circles who could combine their forces to deal with either the outside threat or to put down the rebellion. If these five were not enough, they could send for help to the elector of Mainz, who would call upon a special diet or a special council in Frankfurt. There, it would be determined the severity of the situation, and if the situation did require more assistance, the emperor himself would be called in, who could mobilize the rest of the empire to deal with the situation. Now, this had good side and a bad side. The upside of it was that it could respond very quickly to threats without needing to waste time calling up the emperor. Basically, you can deal things on a local level. Given the difficulties of travel time, you want to handle these things as quickly as possible, not wait for the several weeks it could possibly take to reach the emperor, and by the time he mobilizes his forces, gets, I mean, it's a huge landmass here. Getting troops from one end of the empire to the other, it's going to take a while. So things can be handled on a local level pretty easily and swiftly. Now, the downside to this is up to half of the empire, up to 5 of these circles, could be at war before anybody had to actually bother to tell the emperor. And this means that something that if they had just showed up with overwhelming force or had begun mobilization sooner, they could have dealt with this problem before it spiraled out of control, and this would come back to bite them, but more on that in a future episode.
Okay, so that's enough about the political and governmental structure of the Holy Roman Empire. Let's move on to something a little bit less complex. Let's talk about religion, because actually, yes, that is much less complex. So, the Holy Roman Empire and the rest of Western Europe was overwhelmingly Christian at this time. Specifically, it was Catholic. This was after the Great Schism in 1054, which split the church between the Orthodox East and the Catholic West. The Holy Roman Empire and its environs were almost exclusively Catholic under the sway of the papacy. Now, Catholicism was a major unifying factor in what would otherwise be a very fractured empire. Although these myriad nobles were opposed to each other oftentimes along political or economic or regional grounds, they would very often be unified, or they were actually very much unified by a common religious tradition. So things were actually working pretty well for the Holy Roman Empire, and things were going along fairly smoothly until 1517, when right in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, a monk spoke out against what he saw as corruption in the Catholic Church. Now, things got a little bit out of hand after that, and next thing you know, Lutheranism is now a thing. And because of Lutheranism, now that's yet one more thing that the people of the Holy Roman Empire were divided over. The unifying force of Catholicism was now no longer there. So the Habsburgs themselves were very staunch Catholics, and this, however, put them at odds with the increasing numbers of Lutheran nobles who were directly underneath them, as well as larger and larger sections of the population as a whole. Now, the philosophies of the two different faiths actually did eventually bleed over into political life. Lutheranism is much more humanist than Catholicism, and lay members of the congregation have a greater role in church life than in Catholicism. For example, the idea that someone should be able to interpret scripture for themselves is a very Lutheran concept. Actually, at this point, the only language the Bible could be printed in was in Latin. There were a couple exceptions here and there, but basically, if you wanted to read the Bible, you had to read Latin. In this case, you would have to, learn that instead of, say, German, which Luther actually famously translated the Bible into so that the average person could interpret it. So there was much more emphasis on the average person, the lay member of the congregation, taking an active role within church life. This is in stark contrast with Catholicism, which had centuries of tradition in which particularly hierarchy was of utmost importance. And your role is very much contingent on what level of society you're in or what level of this hierarchy you're in. Now, this is very appealing to people on the top of the hierarchy, for example, the Pope and the Cardinals. And if you want to bleed this over into political life, guys like the Habsburgs, higher ranking nobles, yeah, they really like this structure. However, lesser ranked nobles or nobles who, say, want to undermine the power of people above them or just, the average citizen, well, they generally didn't like this. I mean, if people who like hierarchies are people who tend to benefit from it, and that would be people on top. People on the bottom of the hierarchy, well, they don't like it all that much. Now, Habsburg authority, which was already strained to begin with, might not like the idea that lower members of society might have a greater role than had previously been allowed. Now, self-determination was a factor in this, of course. Many times nobles would choose Lutheranism as opposed to Catholicism due to just personal convictions. They thought, okay, this Luther guy I do like what he says. Okay, sure, great. But sometimes they chose Lutheranism just as a way to undermine Habsburg power. So the emperor, as the defender of the faith, he could simply not allow such obvious heresy to take root. So once Lutheranism became more than just this localized heresy and started to spread, this led to a very long series of incredibly bloody conflicts that is way too long to get into here. It's a long, complex thing, and people have made academic careers out of the wars of religion, but just suffice it to say, a lot of people died, a lot of property was destroyed, it was just absolute chaos. And this eventually culminated in what is known as the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which codified the concept of, and I'm going to mispronounce this, I had 2 semesters of Latin in college, but I'm going to mispronounce it anyway, cuius regio eius religio, which I know I just completely butchered, but basically it means whose realm, his religion. That's the literal translation. And it is exactly what it says on the tin. You have whose realm, like whoever rules this particular section of the empire, like the noble in charge, whatever his religious belief is, the rest of the people living underneath him had to practice that religion as well. So if the noble of a particular region was Catholic, everybody underneath him was also Catholic. If he was Lutheran, everybody underneath him was also Lutheran. If you were unwilling or unable to convert, you had to leave. It wasn't fair, it wasn't nice, and nobody cared. Now, of course, there were varying degrees of enforcement of this. You did have, of course, people practicing in secret, and you sometimes would have people practicing the opposite religion quite openly because the noble really just didn't care one way or another, and they just, got along fairly well. But generally speaking, that was the rule. If the ruler was one religion, everybody underneath him was also that religion as well. So this did help unify the religious experience within each province, which actually helped to further undermine the empire. This once unifying force that was empire-wide was now no longer there. Oh, and on top of all this, there was a major oversight within the Peace of Augsburg, in that it did not include the Calvinists at all, or any other Protestant denomination, the Anabaptists, and I think there are a few others floating around out there. Particularly the Calvinists were simply not considered. This was because the nobles that were signing the Peace of Augsburg were either Catholic or Lutheran, so they only included Catholicism or Lutheranism, and the others were simply, there was an oversight and nobody really thought about them at all. This would come back to bite them in 1618 when the 30 Years' War broke out, but we'll get to that in a future episode. Now, despite its shortcomings, the Peace of Augsburg actually did ensure peace, or at least some degree of stability within the Holy Roman Empire. And from its signing in 1555 until the outbreak of the 30 Years' War in 1618, actually the Holy Roman Empire was very peaceful. Things got along as smoothly as you can, considering the situation there. Things actually were, fairly quiet within the borders of the empire. So the Holy Roman Empire, in the years leading up to the outbreak of the 30 Years' War, was actually relatively stable. The rest of Europe was a tinderbox ready to explode. Spain was in the middle of a decades-long revolt in the Netherlands, with Dutch rebels trying their best to break away from Habsburg control. This was the Spanish Habsburgs, not the Austrian Habsburgs, but the two are very closely, well, they are related, but they have very good relationships with one another, but that's another story for another episode. In any case, the Spanish were also involved in a territorial dispute with the French. The Spanish were also involved. They're making a lot of friends. They were dealing with near constant English piracy, so they're at each other's throats there. In Sweden, way up in the north, the Swedish king was eager to expand his country's power and influence and was in the middle of annexing Estonia from the Russian Tsar. The Ottomans, although they suffered a defeat decades earlier at the Battle of Lepanto, were still looking westward and were seeking to probe into Europe's soft underbelly through Austria, which would put them directly in conflict with the Holy Roman Empire, right as this war was about to break out, and we'll get to that in a later episode. And in the city of Prague, which was in what is now the modern-day Czech Republic, religious disputes were about to boil over, and it would provide the spark that set the whole thing ablaze. So, yes, that is it for this episode. When we pick up next time, the defenestration of Prague, the outbreak of the 30 Years' War, and hopefully a little bit more into the narrative as to what's going on. This is just something, I guess you can say, an introduction, let you know what's going on within the Holy Roman Empire. And, just basically, this is, the preface. This is the introduction. So that is it for this video. The rest of this series coming out around whenever I get around to it, and this is not going to turn into the 30 Years War channel. I'm going to be doing other videos as well, so stay tuned for those. And that's pretty much it. Please hit the like and subscribe button. More videos coming out whenever I get around to it, and have a good day. Or don't have a good day, your adults. Have any kind of day you want. See you later.